Dead America, the Second Month. The Portland Conflict, Part 4. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 40. Fingers sped down the back roads towards White Salmon in a race against the clock. It had been a few hours since the captured Sergeant Burris had momentarily broken free and activated his emergency beacon, alerting nearby troops of his location. Private Jarvis and Zion were crammed into the back seat area of the truck. Corporal Jinx sat in the front seat, staring ahead intently, running through scenarios of how to deal with what was coming. If Sergeant Dickerson led the rescue mission, he knew he could reason with him. If Captain Odom was leading the charge, things could get a little dicey. Zion took a deep breath as he studied the concern on Jinx's face. "Brother, you've had that same look on your face for damn near an hour now," he said. "Why don't you share with the rest of the class?" "Just trying to figure out our next move," the corporal replied. "Walk us through it, then," Zion said. "Wish I could, but I haven't come up with anything," Jinx admitted. "First time for everything," Jarvis muttered. "Doing my best," the corporal snapped. She withered under his tone, offering him an apologetic nod and leaning back in her seat. "You're gonna have to figure something out," Zion said firmly, "because my people aren't going to take a military incursion lightly." "I know," Jinx replied with a deep sigh. "If we can just beat the reinforcements to town, we might have a chance." "What are Davila and the others going to do?" Jarvis asked. The corporal shook his head. "Hopefully they're smart enough to try and de-escalate the situation and not get involved," he said. "You think your men would be shooting back at their own?" Zion asked. "I think they know you're on the up and up, and none of them are particularly fond of Burris," Jinx explained. "But even so, I don't know what they'll do." Fingers looked over to a sign on the side of the road, reading White Salmon, 2 miles. He reached onto his dash, picking up a walkie-talkie and clicking it on. "This is Fingers. Anybody there?" he asked. "Come back." There were a few moments of silence before a frantic voice popped up on the radio. It was male, and he didn't recognize it. "We're under attack!" the man yelled. "We're under attack!" "Settle the fuck down and start giving specifics," Fingers replied smoothly. "Where?" "North of the bridge," the man said frantically. "Near the highway entrance." "How many?" Fingers asked. "A lot," came the reply. Fingers looked at Jinx and the corporal shook his head. "Just get us close," he said. Fingers nodded and hit the gas. As he approached the southern portion of the town, he laid on the horn, letting the guards know that they were coming through. "Hang on, this is gonna suck," he warned. Everybody did as instructed, as Fingers yanked the speeding truck off of the road, bouncing off the slight ditch and catching a little bit of air before slamming down. He veered off to the right, plowing through a wooden fence reinforced with barbed wire, sending debris flying through the air and causing the occupants to lurch forward. Fingers didn't budge, however, remaining focused while keeping control of the truck. He swerved it back onto the road and hit the gas, speeding through the southern portion of town. As they approached the bridge, they could hear gunshots in the distance, and there were a lot of them. "Hope you got a plan," Zion said warily. Jinx stared forward, running through every idea he could think of, but nothing felt even remotely possible. Finally, he let out a sigh and a nod, knowing what he had to do. "Yeah, I got one," he said, sounding resigned. "Don't get too excited about it," Zion said dryly. "Just get me close to the fight," Jinx instructed. "I'll handle it. The rest of you just take cover." "Jinx," Jarvis warned. "That's an order, Private," he said firmly. "Oh, you giving me orders now?" Zion demanded, cocking a brow. "If you want this to end peacefully, then yes," the corporal said. Zion stared him down for a beat, and then relented, giving him a nod. He had no reason not to trust him after everything they'd been through. "All right," he agreed. A battle unfolded a couple of blocks up, just on the outskirts of town. A few soldiers had pushed forward into the outer line of buildings, with some movement on the highway leading into town. There were shots coming from the opposite side of the road, pinning them down. It didn't look like either side was making much progress, the battle seeming relatively new. Jinx pointed to an alley behind the first building. "Park there," he said. Fingers whipped the vehicle into the alley, and before it even came to a full stop, Jinx burst out of it, leaving his weapon behind. Jarvis shook her head as she stared at the discarded weapon. "What are you doing, Jinx?" she thought wildly. The corporal picked up the pace, running around to the side of the building, heading out into the middle of the road and marching forward with his arms raised high above him. He approached the intersection and began yelling at the top of his lungs as bullets flew all around him. "Sergeant Dickerson!" he bellowed. "Sergeant Dickerson!" He continued to repeat the yelling request as bullets impacted the ground all around him. By the time he got to the middle of the intersection, both sides had stopped shooting. Everyone was just staring at him, his arms raised, yelling at the top of his lungs for the sergeant he prayed was present. Finally, after several incredibly tense moments, Sergeant Dickerson emerged from a storefront, his rifle firmly in his grasp, but lowered. He was hesitant, on guard as if he expected someone to take a shot at him. "There you are!" Jinx cried. "We need to have a word." Dickerson looked bewildered, shaking his head slowly as he took in the corporal with his hands still raised. Jinx glanced over his shoulder and motioned for the citizens of White Salmon to lower their guns. Zion peered out from the window of one of the buildings, giving him a thumbs up. "This is Zion," he called. "If anybody on my side takes a shot, you'll have to deal with me personally. This situation is under control." Jinx gave him a thumbs up back with one of his outstretched hands. He turned back to Dickerson, who had his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You are out of your goddamn mind, you know that?" he demanded. Jinx grinned. "Boy, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that," he drawled. "And put your arms down," the sergeant snapped. "Nobody's going to shoot you today." "Day's not over yet," Jinx replied, lowering his hands. Dickerson scowled. "That's not funny," he said. "Is it just you up here?" Jinx asked with a smirk. The sergeant shook his head. "Captain Odom took a team to the apartment complex outside of Portland," he explained. "After Burris, and then no response from you, he wanted to get to the bottom of this quickly." Jinx sighed, shaking his head. "Safe to say he's going to be on the warpath once he gets there," he said. "What the hell happened?" Dickerson asked, suddenly sounding exhausted. "Long story short is that Sergeant Burris and his team opened fire on a few of the civilians from this town who were there to retrieve some of their possessions," Jinx explained. "Killed one of theirs." "Damn," the sergeant grumbled. "That's not even the bad part," Jinx continued. "Zion, the leader of this community, ended up killing 4 of Burris's men." Dickerson's eyes widened with disbelief, and the corporal knew he was imagining just how Odom was going to react when finding all of the bodies. "No, he's not going to be happy," he breathed. "Who survived?" "They took Burris captive. He's safely tucked away in their jail here," Jinx said. "And a young woman, Private Stinson, is still down there." Dickerson's brow furrowed. "She said to hell with it and just stayed?" he asked. Jinx shook his head. "No, she was shell-shocked, so I ordered her to take a couple days off to recover," he replied. "Between seeing her friends killed and having to ride out a zombie swarm in the trunk of a sedan, I felt like she needed some time to regroup." The sergeant nodded slowly. "We'll make sure Odom knows that so she doesn't end up in punitive work detail," he said. "But we got a bigger problem." "Tell me about it," Jinx quipped. "The captain is going to be pissed," Dickerson said. "He's going to want his pound of flesh for the death of his men." "Have him take it out on Burris's hide," the corporal said. "It's his fault this went down the way it did." "Why? Because Zion told you so?" the sergeant asked dryly. "No, because Stinson told me so," Jinx said firmly. Dickerson pursed his lips thoughtfully for a moment, before nodding in agreement. "Still, you know how Odom is," he said. "Even if you and I believe Zion and Stinson, I don't see the captain taking a private's word over a sergeant's." "Well, before we figure out what the hell we're going to do about it, we should probably sit down with Zion," Jinx suggested. Dickerson nodded. "And anybody else from his group that was there," he added. Jinx looked around, finding the same building where he'd had his first talk with the White Salmon crew. He pointed to it. "Meet me there in 5, he said. "Just have your men hang tight in those buildings. I'll send over some of my guys to brief them." "Okay," Dickerson said, nodding. The 2 men hurried off, knowing they'd need to formulate a plan before Odom got to town. Chapter 2. Dickerson sat alone, hanging out in the building at the same table Jinx and Zion had sat at the previous day. He didn't have to wait long for Jinx to arrive with Zion and Calvin in tow. "Sergeant Dickerson, allow me to introduce Zion and Calvin," Jinx said, motioning to the men. Dickerson stood up and extended his hand to Zion, who paused, glancing over at the corporal and receiving a slight nod. Zion leaned forward and shook. "Jinx vouches for you," he said. "That's good enough for me." The 3 of them sat down in front of the sergeant, and he took his seat as well. "Jinx, you don't waste time in making an impression, do you?" Dickerson asked dryly. The corporal shrugged. "Just kind of happens when you're me," he said. The sergeant chuckled and shook his head. "So, we got more trouble coming our way?" Zion asked. Dickerson sighed. "Afraid so," he said. "And soon. So we need to figure out what to do about it." "Guessing the truth don't matter in this particular situation?" Zion asked. "It matters to Jinx and me. But our captain, he's a by-the-book guy," Dickerson said, shaking his head. "He's going to believe Burris." Zion jutted out his chin. "And what happens when he does that?" he asked. "He's going to want the people who killed his men," Dickerson said. "Which I take is you 2. He paused, doing some math in his head, then blinked. "Wait, I'm sorry. You 2 took out 4 highly trained troops?" "Just because I look goofy as hell doesn't mean I don't know my way around a rifle, son," Calvin drawled, crossing his arms. "And you're really going to bet against someone that looks like me?" Zion asked, his broad shoulders practically rippling through his shirt. "Not to mention someone who has built up 2 settlements during the apocalypse?" The sergeant raised his palm apologetically. "Yeah, I put my foot firmly in my mouth there," he admitted. "No offense intended." "You're good," Zion assured him. "Don't worry about offending us. We're thick-skinned. What you need to worry about doing is finding a way to appease Captain Hardass that's coming our way. Knowing him, he's going to want you to turn yourselves in to face a military trial up in Seattle," Dickerson mused. "Which, to be honest, probably won't be for quite some time since it's not even functioning yet." Zion raised his chin. "Let me go ahead and stop you right there," he said. "Of all the possible things that's going to happen, that ain't one of them. I ain't rotting in a military prison cell for defending myself." "I don't blame you," the sergeant said. "Well, that option's out," Jinx quipped. "What else we got?" Everybody just sat there, staring at the table, racking their brains. Finally, Calvin snapped his fingers in excitement, startling everyone. "I got it!" he cried. "What if we weren't here?" "I'm pretty sure Captain Odom would just wait for you to get back from whatever run you're on," the sergeant said slowly, as if talking to a child. No, Calvin said, waving his hands back and forth in front of his face. "That's not what I mean." "Then what the hell do you mean then?" Zion asked. "I ain't running again." "Not running. Just a temporary exile," Calvin continued. "This captain sounds like a mad dog, but I'm guessing he has more important things to do than just
hang out here for weeks on end just in case we show back up, am I right?"
The soldiers exchanged a glance and nodded in agreement. "A few days, at most," Dickerson said. "He's going to want to do his best to set up relations with the camp even if he can't get his hands on you two. But where the hell would you go?" Zion cocked his head. "Man asks a great question," he said dryly.
"We had a couple of newcomers roll into town a few days ago," Calvin explained. "Came in from the south a ways out. I didn't talk to them, just overheard them at the restaurant talking with a few others. They said they had a survivor camp somewhere south of here that was expanding and clearing out someplace. Figure we can go kick around down there for a bit, help 'em out, maybe make some new friends."
"You think that would work?" Jinx asked. The sergeant nodded. "We can cover for them," he said. "Say we came looking, but they fled when confronted." "So you gonna make us sound like cowards?" Zion demanded. "If I have to," Dickerson explained. "Do you really care about lies told about you if those lies keep you out of a prison cell?" Zion sighed. "Fair enough," he admitted. "Never did before." Jinx shook his head. "If we do that, he's going to order pursuit," he said. "Then we fake it," the sergeant said. "Find a nice motel off the beaten path and kick our feet up for a few days."
"You're assuming he sends us," Jinx said. "He might send Burris after them."
Dickerson gritted his teeth. "Damn," he said. "Burris would probably insist."
"What if you were already in pursuit?" Calvin suggested.
Everyone looked at him, blinking in shock that he'd come up with the answer to their problems twice in one conversation.
"Why's everybody looking at me like that?" he demanded.
"Just surprising the hell out of me," Zion admitted, "but in a good way."
"My team's down for it," Jinx said. "What's the cover for here? Boris has already seen us together and is going to tell Odom that we're in cahoots."
"And you were doing so on my orders," Dickerson suggested. "You were on an infiltrate mission to gather intel about the community, to see if they were a threat or not, which means you had to play along until it was time to strike. You made a play for Zion and Calvin, but they escaped. Just before my team arrived, I ordered pursuit, and that's where we are." Zion cocked a skeptical brow. "Is your captain going to buy that bullshit?" he asked. "He seems to have a soft spot for Burris." "He has a soft spot for rank," Dickerson said. "He put me in charge of Jinx's operation, so he'll believe me." The corporal nodded in agreement.
"What do you think? A week?" he asked.
"Should be plenty of time for Odom to do his due diligence here," Dickerson agreed. "Although it would help move things along if you could get whoever is going to be in the leadership role here to agree to friendly relations with the military." He eyed Zion for the last bit. "His name's Edward, and he'll do what I say," Zion assured him. "He'll bend over backwards to give your captain whatever he wants." "Okay, that's the plan," the sergeant declared. "We gotta move, though, because it won't be too much longer before Odom is up on us."
"We need to find those newcomers and figure out where we're going," Zion said. "They were putting up new people in the south of town," Calvin said. "Shouldn't be too hard to find them. Don't think we've had too many new people lately." "Okay, I'll get my team and we'll meet you there in 10, Jinx said. "South barricade?"
"The one Fingers just rolled through?" Zion asked dryly.
"Yeah, that one,"
Jinx replied with a chuckle. Zion nodded. "Let's do it," he said. Everybody got up, but Zion paused and looked back towards the sergeant. "You all right, Dickerson?" he said, holding out his hand again. "You keep this up, we gonna be friends." "Look forward to it," Dickerson replied, and they shook. The group walked outside, and Zion paused next to Jinx. "I appreciate what you're doing," he said.
"What are friends for?"
the corporal asked with a grin. "Shit. After that stunt you just pulled in the road there, we're brothers now," Zion replied with his own smile. "I'm honored," Jinx replied. "I'm just happy you didn't fall off the boat while we was on the river," Zion said. Jinx raised a confused eyebrow.
"Okay," he asked slowly. "I mean, I can swim."
"That's amazing to hear given those 2-ton steel balls swinging between your legs," Zion drawled. "I would have figured you would have sunk right to the bottom." Jinx cracked up, shaking his head. Shit, man. Just strolling out into the middle of a firefight like you out on a Sunday stroll, Zion continued, throwing up his hands. Lunatic! I love it. They laughed together, and Jinx clapped him on the shoulder.
Just wait. You haven't seen anything yet, he said with a wink.
Chapter 3. Zion, Jinx, and a handful of privates loaded up a couple of vehicles with food and other supplies, like sleeping bags and weapons. Fingers sauntered up holding a duffel bag.
Got a few party favors for you, he declared, holding it out. Y'all took a lot of my stock last outing, but I whipped up a few fun things.
Appreciate that, Zion said with a grin, taking the bag. Fingers nodded and stepped aside, revealing a couple that looked to be in their late 20s, both blonde and fit, definitely rural.
Hey, here they are, Calvin said with a grin. This is Carrie and Matthew.
It's a pleasure,
Carrie said with a wide smile. Pleasure's ours, Zion replied, inclining his head towards them. So, Calvin said you want to go help out our friends, Matthew asked, shoving his hands in his pockets. That depends, Zion replied. Who are your friends? Matthew raised his palms. No need to be accusatory, friend, he said. We're a bunch of survivors, just like you.
Only there's a lot more of us, Carrie added, which is why we were clearing out Redmond.
A lot more? Jinx asked. How many more? And where?
The couple exchanged a glance.
We don't have anything to hide, Mr. Military Man, Carrie said dryly. We're from Bend, Oregon. It's about 15 miles south of Redmond, and we have close to 10,000 survivors there.
Both Zion and Jinx exclaimed, 10,000? At the same time, prompting a chuckle from the group. Yeah, I know. It's crazy to say in this day and age, Matthew drawled. Jinx took advantage of the others' laughter to mouth the word militia to Zion, and he pursed his lips in thought. How'd you manage to pull that off? He asked, as light-hearted sounding as possible. You got your own army or something down there?
Oh, no. Just neighbors looking after neighbors, that's all, Carrie said.
Ben's pretty big, isn't it? Jinx asked. That would have been a nightmare when all this started.
Admittedly, we got lucky, Matthew said, holding up 2 fingers. 2 things really saved us. The first was that our hospital doctors were on top of things. Saw something was coming and convinced a lot of people to stay home for everyone's sake for a couple of days if they were sick. They issued that statement the day before things went crazy, which helped contain a lot of the chaos that went on in other cities.
And the second? Jinx asked.
There was a gun show in town, Carrie replied, so we had more than enough to handle the chaos that did break out.
Zion and Jinx both chuckled, if for no other reason than to play along, because neither of them were convinced that they were dealing with ordinary civilians.
That'll do it, all right, Jinx said.
So, if you have Ben secure, why do you want to move up to Redmond and risk people's lives? Zion asked. Don't you have plenty of room for everybody? The room's not the problem, Matthew replied, shaking his head. Plenty of space for people to have their own home with no fighting.
But a lot of people means a lot of mouths to feed, Carrie added. Winter's going to be here before you know it, so not exactly a great time to be planting crops, you know.
And Redmond wasn't as lucky as we were, Matthew continued, which means there are a lot of well-stocked store shelves and kitchen pantries that are ripe for the picking. Zion and Jinx exchanged another look, clearly conveying that their story was at least plausible.
One more thing that doesn't quite sit right with me, though,
Zion said slowly. Carrie shrugged.
Like I said, we have nothing to hide,
she promised.
If you're from Bend, and your people are trying to clear out Redmond, then what you doing all the way up here? He asked. Shouldn't you be helping out?
Carrie swallowed hard, lowering her gaze and turning away to sidle up to Matthew. If it was an act, it was convincing. Her family is from Portland, Matthew said as he rubbed her back. We came up here hoping to find some survivors who might know what happened to them. We know it's a long shot,
But it's a shot you gotta take, you know.
I'm sorry, ma'am, Zion said, keeping his tone sincere. I didn't mean to upset you. She brushed a tear from her eye, or what looked like one.
It's okay. I'm sorry, she said. The last couple of days being here have been rough. Haven't found any survivors, even close to where they lived.
Well, we just brought in some new people a few hours ago, Calvin piped up. They're getting some grub right now, but once they're done, Fingers can take you to them. You should go talk to Adam. He'll introduce you to everyone.
Carrie smiled and nodded at him.
Thank you,
she said. Zion stepped away with Jinx for a sidebar as the others talked. What do you think? He asked quietly. Jinx tilted his head back and forth. Probably a trap, he finally said. That gonna be a problem? Zion asked. The corporal shrugged.
I mean, I got nothing better to do, he said. Plus, if they have an army that size that close, we should probably know about it.
Agreed, Zion said. They headed back over to the group.
Okay, we're going to go see if your friends in Redmond need a hand, Jinx said.
Matthew smiled brightly.
Oh, that is fantastic to hear, he gushed.
Any idea where to find them? Zion asked. Or who to ask for? Matthew nodded like a bobblehead.
They're going to be easy to find, he said. All you have to do is go south on this highway until it merges with the 97. Little ways up the road, just before you hit the outskirts of town, there's a giant barbecue place that's going to be on your left. Has a chef pig mascot. Can't miss it.
A chef pig? Jinx barked a laugh.
Nothing like a cannibal mascot.
Matthew smirked.
Yeah, but it's memorable, he said. Shame they aren't open, 'cause their pulled pork was pretty memorable, too.
The corporal groaned wistfully.
I would kill for some brisket right now, he said. When you get there, just ask for Blake, Rob, or Jesse, Matthew said. Those are the 3 team leaders clearing out the city, so one of them should be there. Just drop our names and you'll be fine.
There was a round of handshakes between the two parties. Appreciate the information, Zion said.
Any time,
Matthew said, offering a charming smile.
Oh, and you should know that one of the pit masters from the barbecue place is safely in our camp. So once we get the farms back up, we'll save you a plate.
Jinx grinned. Can't wait, he said. As they walked away, his grin dropped and he led Zion and Calvin over to the soldiers who were just finishing packing the rest of their stuff.
So, what's the word, Corporal?
Private de Villa asked.
We're most likely walking into a zombie and militia-infested trap, he quipped.
Private Stein sighed.
Nothing's ever easy for you, is it, Jinx? He asked.
The corporal smirked and shook his head. How many were talking? Private Birch asked. Jinx tilted his head back and forth.
Probably just a relative handful in Redmond, he said.
20, 30 maybe?
How in the hell is that a relative handful? Birch asked, eyes wide.
They claim to have over 10,000 in Bend, Zion said. Birch nodded slowly.
Okay.
Relative, he breathed.
Forget 10,000. Are we really rolling up on 30 armed and trained men and expecting to take them out?
Private Rollins asked, raising his hand. Jinx shook his head.
We don't know that they're hostile towards us yet, he said, and I aim to keep it that way. So we help them and hope for the best. Everybody good with that?
Everyone nodded in agreement.
Good. Let's get a move on, because it's a haul down to Redmond, Jinx said.
The group piled into the 2 vehicles, but Zion lingered, waving for Fingers to come over. When he arrived, he kept his voice low. You keep an eye on those 2, he said. If they go anywhere near a sensitive area, I want them locked up.
You want me to lock them up just to be sure?
Fingers asked. Zion contemplated for a few moments, but ultimately shook his head. Not until they've done something to deserve it, he said. But I don't trust them.
I'll take care of it, Fingers promised. Y'all be safe.
Zion nodded and started up the vehicle, tossing it into gear and leading the caravan south on the highway towards Redmond. Chapter 4. The sun had long since vanished on the horizon, another long and uncertain night ahead of them. Jinx was in the lead vehicle with Zion, and Calvin and Birch were asleep in the back seat, as they had been for the past hour. The chorus of snoring went back and forth, and Jinx snorted.
"It's like dueling banjos back there," he said.
Zion chuckled, shaking his head. They sat for another moment in silence before he spoke up. "Can I ask you a question, man?"
"Anything you want,"
Jinx replied.
"When we first met, you said you were just a corporal, but it wasn't because you weren't capable,"
Zion said slowly. Jinx nodded.
"That's true," he agreed.
"You feel like sharing the story behind that?" Zion asked. The corporal shrugged.
"Sure," he said. "I don't talk about it a lot, because I don't really care about rank, especially these days. I mean, you saw me talking with Sergeant Dickerson. He knows me and what I can do, and treats me as such. Going to be a lot more of that kind of mentality going forward, I think."
Zion nodded. "I agree," he said.
"So this was a couple years ago over in the sandbox," Jinx began. "I had done something to piss off my CO, which, to be honest, I can't even remember what it was. At that point in the tour, I had done so much to annoy him that if I even looked at him wrong, he'd give me gate duty."
"Gate duty?" Zion asked, cocking a brow.
"We were nearing the end of our deployment, so we were mostly on base prepping, getting the next team up to speed on what was going on locally. That kind of thing,"
Jinx explained.
"Gate duty meant I got to spend 12 hours at the front gate checking people in and out, keeping out troublemakers."
"So like a doorman at a nightclub," Zion said.
Jinx smirked. "Yeah, just with much bigger guns," he drawled.
Zion laughed. "You obviously never saw what I was packing when I was a doorman," he said. Jinx joined in, laughing.
"So it was just a regular day, nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "Just the usual assortment of troops coming in and out. A couple of marked shipping trucks, the normal. The base was on the edge of town just off of the main road. The turnoff to the highway was about half a mile up the road, so we'd occasionally get the wrong turn. They usually caught up pretty quick, so no harm, no foul, you know?" He shrugged. "Well, my CO happened to be up there, watching me like a hawk, when we had one of these wrong turns. Like most people his rank, he hadn't spent much time in this area, and was only there because of me. So of course, when he saw this small family vehicle make the turn into our driveway, he immediately started yelling, barking out orders to fire on them."
He sighed.
"I tell him we're fine, but he keeps ordering me to fire on them, and I refuse. The car was still 100 yards away, so I had plenty of time to act if they kept coming."
Zion's eyes widened. "Did you ever think it was one of those bombers?" he asked.
Jinx shook his head. "I could see pretty clearly through my scope that there were multiple people in the car. Most likely a family," he said. "Bombers don't typically bring along passengers because that's wasted space where explosives would go. You know?"
Zion nodded. "Plus more things that could go wrong," he mused. "Don't want someone changing their minds at the last second."
"Exactly," Jinx agreed. "So this CO is yelling in my ear to fire, saying he's ordering me to do it. I tell him we're fine and that it's a wrong turn. The car had already stopped when it happened. The CO reached down and grabbed the rifle from my hand and brought it up to his shoulder, aiming it towards the car. I immediately popped up, smacking the barrel up before punching him in the nose to reclaim my weapon." He tongued his cheek. "By the time the others at the post rushed over to pick his fat ass up, the car had already turned around and drove off. He stood there, blood rushing down the front of his face as I pointed to the car, saying, 'See? Told you. Wrong turn.' It didn't matter to him, though.
He got what he wanted.
Zion shook his head in disbelief. So what happened? He asked.
MPs came and picked me up, cooled my heels in the brig for a few days until they could hear my case,
Jinx explained.
Typical dog and pony show after that. They busted me down a rank for disobeying a superior officer.
He held up his fingers, doing finger quotes sarcastically on the last word. Not for striking him? Zion asked, brow furrowed in confusion.
Funnily enough, no,
Jinx replied with a shrug.
There had been some high-profile cases of civilians losing their lives, and they treated it as though I was trying to prevent another incident.
So they penalized you for not firing on them, but didn't punish you for stopping someone else from firing on them? Zion said slowly.
How the hell does that make sense? Something chain of command,
Jinx scoffed.
I don't know, but I didn't really care either. I stopped innocent people from dying that day, and I was okay with the fallout. And turns out it worked out all right for me, because my CO was moved to an office job after the incident, and I got Captain Odom in his place.
The same captain that's forcing us to go on this little vacation? Zion asked dryly. Jinx raised a palm.
Don't get me wrong. I think he puts way too much stock into taking the word of higher-ranked soldiers, he said. But he's of the same mindset as Dickerson and myself. We're out here to save lives, not take them.
Zion sighed. If you say so, he said. I take you at your word on that one. I do appreciate you sharing that story with me. I have a newfound respect for you.
See, saving lives is paying dividends still,
Jinx said. Up ahead, the moonlight glinted off of a giant pig wearing a grilling apron and holding a big slab of meat, grinning at them from the barbecue sign. Jinx pointed to it.
That's our place,
he said, and reached into the back seat, smacking the two sleeping men in the legs to wake them up.
Huh?
Calvin slurred.
What's going on?
We're here, Jinx said. The two men nodded, rubbing their eyes and blinking rapidly, working on waking themselves up as Zion turned into the parking lot. There were half a dozen pickup trucks parked there, and they pulled off to the far side, turning around and facing the road in case they needed to make a hasty getaway. Jinx looked out towards the restaurant, finding a faint flicker of light peeking out from the cracks in the windows. So, we just go up and knock or what? Zion asked. But as if on cue, 4 armed men emerged from the front door, guns raised and aimed at the vehicles.
Welcoming committee,
Jinx muttered.
Keep this thing running.
Zion nodded as the corporal opened the door, stepping out with his hands high in the air.
I think you're lost, mister,
the lead gunman called.
Actually, I think this is our destination, Jinx replied. We met your friends, Matthew and Carrie. They told us you needed some help with the zombie problem, so here we are.
The gunmen all shared wary glances, giving each other the side eye as if they didn't buy the story. Jinx sighed.
How about this, he said,
arms still high.
Why don't one of you run inside and get Rob, Blake, or Jesse for us? Maybe they'll be able to tell us we're in the right place or not.
The lead gunman inclined his head towards one of his pack, and they scurried back inside the restaurant. After several moments of tense silence, the corporal couldn't take it any longer.
Not big on small talk, huh? He asked.
My mama told me never to talk to strangers, the lead gunman drawled with a sneer.
Well, in that case, I'm Jinx,
the corporal said.
What's your name?
Before the gunman could reply, a man emerged from the restaurant. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and he wasn't carrying a weapon. He also didn't look military at all.
So, you know Carrie and Matthew, huh?
He asked, coming to stand just ahead of the lead gunman.
You think that's good enough to get you into our good graces?
Jinx shrugged, keeping his hands as high as they could go.
Hey, look, man,
he trailed off, blinking expectantly.
Blake,
the man supplied.
Sorry, Blake.
Jinx corrected with a nod.
We heard from Matthew and Carrie that you were clearing out Redmond of zombies, and they thought you could use a hand. Now, I have 2 carloads full of well-trained warriors who are more than willing to lend a hand. But we can turn around and go chill at a resort for a few days if you're not interested."
"And you're doing this out of the kindness of your heart?"
Blake asked dryly. Jinx shrugged.
"We needed to get out for a few days. Figured we could do some good and maybe make a friend or 2 in the process," he admitted. "Everybody needs friends these days, don't they, Blake?"
He eyed the soldier, studying him carefully, seemingly unsure about his innocent tone.
"Hard to be friends when I don't even know who you are," he said.
"Well, I'm Corporal Eddie Jenkins, but you can call me Jinx," the corporal said brightly. "I have 5 soldiers from my guard with me, and a couple of civilians who are bigger badasses than any of us. Zion and Calvin."
Blake frowned.
"Military, huh?" he asked sourly. "Bold of you to come out this far. Haven't seen a soldier boy since this all started. All y'all turned tail and ran."
"Wasn't my choice," Jinx said simply.
"Fair enough,"
Blake conceded, and cocked his head, sizing him up.
"What are you packing?"
"Standard issue rifles and sidearms," Jinx replied. "Might have a few explosives if the situation arises for them."
He stayed silent for another moment before taking a deep breath.
"Okay, here's the deal," he finally said. "Y'all can come in, and we'll feel each other out. You leave your rifles in the car. Sidearms are fine, just keep 'em holstered. You don't start anything, there won't be anything. If either Rob, Jesse, or myself says it's a no-go, you get back into your vehicles and drive north. You good with those terms?"
Jinx nodded.
"Perfectly fine," he agreed. "Well, come on in then, and we'll get you introduced," Blake said.
Jinx lowered his arms and turned back to the vehicles, stepping over and knocking on the window before motioning for everyone to get out.
"Leave the rifles and keep your sidearms holstered," he instructed, as everyone filed out. "We're guests here, understood?"
There were nods all around, following the directions and leaving the big guns in the car. Blake motioned for his guys to put down his weapons and waited for the group to approach, filing inside, Zion and Jinx bringing up the rear. Blake extended his hand to shake, Zion last.
"You look like you can throw down when the situation requires it," he said as he sized up the massive man.
"Being accused of worse things, I suppose," Zion replied with a shrug.
"Well, I hope it's true, because we have a bit of a situation that could use a little muscle," Blake said.
Zion nodded. "Well, that's why we're here, to help out," he said.
"What you dealing with?" Jinx asked.
"I got a map inside. Be easier to spell it out in there," Blake said,
motioning for them to go ahead. The men got inside, where a couple dozen men sat around, eating and drinking. They all looked exhausted, most of them still covered in zombie guts. Only a few even bothered to look up at the newcomers, but 2 men sauntered over, one that looked to be the same age as Blake, the other in his mid-20s.
"Hey, Blake, what's going on?"
the older one asked.
"These are my 2 right-hand men, Rob and Jesse,"
Blake explained, motioning to the older as the former and the younger as the latter.
"This is Zion, Jinx, and Calvin, and some of their friends. Why don't you take the soldiers over to the buffet and get them some grub?"
Jesse looked a little confused, but Blake gave him a slight nod, and he shrugged, complying. Rob motioned to the soldiers before reaching to tap Jinx on the arm, but the corporal shook his head.
"I'm good, but that crew there will eat you out of house and home, so you might want to keep an eye on them," he said brightly,
but gave Davila a quick glance that clearly said, "Watch yourself."
"Come on, let's go be friendly,"
Davila declared, leading the pack. Rob didn't push the issue, getting a nod from Blake and ushering the soldiers over to the food line.
Come on, get the map over here, Blake said, waving them over.
Zion, Calvin, and Jinx walked over to a small table in the corner, where there was a camping lantern sitting beside a hand-drawn map of downtown. There were several large red X marks over areas to the east of the highway that cut through town, with several black X marks along the highway.
This place was teeming with activity when we started clearing it out, Blake explained. We thought the best course was to clean out the east side since there wasn't a lot there before turning our attention to the west, which has the majority of houses and businesses.
Zion pointed to the two biggest X marks. These are pretty big. What were they? He asked.
Top one's the airport. The bottom one was the convention center, Blake replied.
Calvin blinked, taken aback.
In a town this size?
He asked. Blake chuckled.
I know, right? He drawled. 30,000 people, and they thought they were going to be bringing in major events. Real nice facility. I mean, once you wash off the remnants of 1,000 corpses.
Had them packed in there, did they? Jinx asked.
Blake nodded. Based on what we could tell, it looked like a triage center, overflow from the hospital, he said. As you can probably guess, that didn't end well.
I could imagine that, Jinx agreed.
I've had to clean out a few of those triage centers.
He let out a low whistle while shaking his head.
Level 10 clusterfuck. Even so, we managed to clear it out without bringing too much attention our way, Blake said. Took a couple of days, but we pulled it off. We then had what we needed to block off the underpasses under the highway. Completely sealed off the west side of town. We still have to be careful, because the occasional straggler will show up. But for the most part, the east side of town is free and clear.
So, where's the problem? Zion asked, leaning over. Blake pointed to a marked-up area a few blocks west of the highway. There was a bright red square around a building in the middle of an area marked downtown.
This is our current issue, Blake said, tapping on the square. Our decoy Martin is trapped inside this building, and we need to get him out.
Jinx nodded thoughtfully.
How many of those things are we talking? He asked.
Probably 1,000 of them directly around the building on all sides, Blake said.
The corporal let out another long whistle.
How the hell does that happen? Calvin blurted.
Our plan, which admittedly sounded better on paper than actual implementation, was to draw those things to this building, let them in, and bring it down on top of them, Blake explained.
Jinx nodded slowly.
It's a solid plan, he said. Done that dozens of times in the past few weeks. What went wrong?
Blake sighed.
Before we started drawing them to the building, we blocked off the road to the east, he said, pointing on the map as he spoke. Martin was to get them riled up, pulling them his way and then exiting stage right. We had the next building wide open for him so he could run through it to the waiting vehicle on the next block. But he got way more attention than any of us anticipated, so they pushed their way through the barricades. By the time we figured out what was going wrong, it was too late to do anything about it. He shut off the noisemakers, but you know how those things get. You get a pack of them moving and they'll pull in any roamer within half a mile.
Jinx pursed his lips, leaning over and studying the map, which was fairly detailed with roads and buildings drawn on each block. So, the buildings you've drawn here, are they accurate? He asked.
Blake scoffed. As accurate as a pen and paper map is going to get, he said dryly.
I mean, is there only one building on each block? Jinx corrected.
Blake nodded. Yeah, most of them are single story, but there are a couple that are 2- and 3-story, he replied.
I can work with that, Jinx said, still looking at the paper. Do you know where a 3-story building is?
Blake leaned over and looked, before tapping on a building 2 blocks due south from the one that Martin was in. He marked it with black, then marked the building to the southwest of that one.
"I know for a fact that one is 3 stories," he said. "That other one is 2. Does that do?"
Jinx nodded.
"Another question," he said, holding up a finger.
"Shoot,"
Blake said.
"Carrie and Matthew said you were clearing out this town because you needed supplies for the main camp in Bend," the corporal said.
Blake stiffened, frowning.
"Did they now?"
Jinx held out his palm.
"Relax, not asking about Bend," he assured him. "What I want to know is, are there any buildings down there you want to keep intact?"
Blake shook his head.
"It's mostly office space down there, with a couple of restaurants," he replied. "Not worried about losing those, because most of the food is long since spoiled."
Jinx grinned.
"Perfect," he said.
"But you gotta understand, everything to the east is infested with those things,"
Blake said firmly.
"You make too much noise, then you'll be pulling them your way. The goal is to get Martin out, and the fewer of those things around, the better."
"How much time you need to get him out?" Jinx asked.
"Just need an opening, and a few good men to put down the stragglers," Blake said. "Shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes."
Jinx nodded.
"I can get that for you," he said.
Blake eyed him cautiously.
"Just diving right in, huh?"
he asked.
"We're here to help. Those aren't empty words," Jinx replied.
"What do you need?"
Blake asked. Jinx stepped back from the table, thinking hard.
"Talk it out," Zion suggested.
"Okay," Jinx dragged out the word.
"That 2-story building can be easily rigged to be the diversion. Loud enough to get the crowd around Martin, but quiet enough that it doesn't pull in everything to the west."
Calvin nodded.
"Then what?" he prompted. "Then we have ourselves a barbecue," Jinx declared.
"A barbecue?" Zion asked, cocking a brow. Jinx shrugged.
"It's quiet and effective, especially when they're bunched up like that," he said.
"And you have something that can pull that off?"
Blake asked.
Jinx shook his head.
"Going to need some flammable liquid. A few gallons ought to do," he said. "And need to make a trip to a hardware store."
Blake nodded.
"I can make that happen,"
he said, then let out a whistle. He pointed to a couple of the men who were eating, motioning for them to come over. The duo begrudgingly got up and shambled over, both of them middle-aged and looking out of place amongst the warriors.
"Avery, Colin, I'd like you to meet Jinx," Blake said. "I need you to take him to the hardware store on Pecan Street. Help him get whatever he needs, then assist him on setting up in downtown."
The 2 men sighed, shaking their heads wearily.
"Blake, we've been at this for the last 16 hours, Avery said, rubbing a hand over his bald head. "Everybody has."
"And we're beat, man,"
Colin added, his short and stocky frame wavering on his feet.
"Can't this wait until morning?"
Blake shook his head, raising his voice.
"One of our own is trapped, and we have a plan to get him out," he said. "Now, you are going to man the fuck up and help Jinx out, because it's going to be a lot easier to do this under cover of darkness than after you 2 get a little beauty sleep. Is there a problem with that?"
Both men tensed, straightening up and shaking their heads.
"Good,"
Blake said firmly.
"Now, go get your shit, because we leave in 5.
As the 2 of them ran off, Jinx jerked a thumb over his shoulder.
"If they're too tired, my men and I can handle it," he offered.
Blake shook his head.
"It's okay. They need to keep moving," he said. "And actually, I wanted to ask you a favor."
"Okay," Jinx replied.
"My men are tired, but there is still vital work we need to get done before we can start resting,"
Blake continued.
"The barricades we have up here are minimal. I wonder if you wouldn't mind having them stay behind while we make the run. Help shore up the line?"
Jinx wasn't convinced the offer was on the up and up. But before he could speak, Blake continued talking.
Having fresh eyes would make me feel a whole lot better about things, he said. Can't risk a runner getting set loose.
Jinx pursed his lips, nodding.
That's a good point, he admitted. Okay, I'll have my men stay and help yours out. But who is going to go in and get Martin?
Blake glanced at Zion and Calvin.
If you two wouldn't mind, he said.
Whole reason we're here, Zion said.
Thank you,
Blake said, pressing his palms together.
Jinx, if you want to let your men know what's going on, I'll get my gear and we can head out. Meet out front in a few.
Sounds good, Jinx said, nodding. He walked off, Zion coming close behind while Calvin branched off to grab some food. What is it with you white people in horror situations, always wanting to split up? Zion murmured. Jinx chuckled.
Yeah, I know, he admitted. But it's a good chance for us to figure out what their game is.
Blake, hell, none of these guys seem to be thrilled about us military, but they're all over you.
If I'm not around, maybe they'll open up.
How do you want me to play it? Zion asked.
Like you're his best friend, Jinx said. If he badmouths us, you back him up. Whatever he offers you, agree to it. I know at the end of the day you got my back. I mean, we blew up a hospital together. That kind of bond is a bond for life.
He cracked a smile, and Zion chuckled. All right, you let your troops know what's up, and I'll grab something from the chow line and meet you outside, he said. Jinx nodded and walked over to his men. A few moments later, they emerged from the front door into the parking lot, where 2 SUVs waited for them. Zion handed Jinx a hot dog and a bottle of water as they walked to the vehicles.
Zion, you're with me and Calvin in the lead vehicle, Blake instructed. Jinx, Avery, and Colin will take you where you need to go.
Communication? Jinx asked. Blake motioned to the taller man.
Avery has a walkie-talkie, and I have one too, he said. We should be close enough in downtown to communicate.
Okay, let's set it off, Jinx said. Everybody got into the SUVs, and Zion slid into the passenger seat as Blake fired up the SUV. They pulled out of the parking lot, heading south along the highway for several moments before Blake started to slow down. He pulled off into the grass while continuing to drive. Zion looked over at the makeshift barricade that had a few zombies on it. Blake pulled out the walkie-talkie from his belt, changing the channel on it.
Rob, you copy?
He asked.
I'm here, came the reply. We have invaders at the gate. Why don't you take them on home for us? Blake asked.
Copy that, Rob replied. Zion was a little concerned at the phrasing of all that, so he attempted to make light of it. Some colorful language to tell them about a few zombies, he said. Blake chuckled.
Yeah, well, clearing these things out is boring as hell, he drawled. So we try to liven things up a bit. It's not much fun, but it's something, you know.
Yeah, suppose so, Zion said, looking in the side mirror. The vehicle Jinx was in made a turn onto a side street, vanishing. All he could think was, man, what have we walked into? Chapter 5. Avery is behind the wheel of the SUV, driving slowly down a residential street. Jinx sat behind the driver, looking out down the moonlit streets, finding the roads packed with zombies, all just wandering aimlessly. There were hundreds, as far as the eye could see.
Safe to say we can't use firearms, Jinx said. Not unless we want a ton of company.
This ain't our first rodeo, soldier boy, Colin snapped from the passenger seat. We've been taking care of our own since this all started.
Easy, buddy, the corporal said, holding up a hand. Wasn't implying that you hadn't been taking care of your own. Just making an observation and some small talk.
You'll have to excuse Colin, Avery said, sounding far more diplomatic than his friend. He gets cranky when he doesn't get his nap.
Don't you fucking start with me, Avery, Colin snarled.
See what I mean? Avery asked, rolling his eyes.
So you boys have been through the ringer, huh? Jinx asked.
That happens when you left to deal with the apocalypse on your own, Colin muttered.
Don't have to convince me, Jinx assured them. I thought it was a bitch move to retreat.
The civilians exchanged a quick glance of confusion as the corporal bashed his own people.
Don't get me wrong. I get why some pencil pusher in D.C. might have thought it was the strategic move to make, Jinx continued. And based on the results we've had in Seattle, I'm sure the powers that be will continue listening to them for the foreseeable future. But groups like Zion's, like yours, civilians pulling together and surviving against it just shows we could have dealt with it if we had stayed and fought.
Yeah, well, Colin stammered. It was a bitch move.
So what was your experience like, Jinx? Avery asked.
The corporal's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He asked.
Early days of this, Avery said. What did you have to deal with?
My first days of this were a breeze for me, Jinx replied. My team was one of the first ones ordered to the boats. We were 5 miles offshore before the first wave hit the city we were stationed in. The hardest thing I had to deal with was reading the reports as they came in, and listening to some of the chatter on the radio. Some of the voices I heard will haunt me, hearing the terror and sense of certain doom. But that's rainbows and sunshine compared to what you guys dealt with.
Damn straight it is, Colin snapped.
So when did you finally get into the fight?
About 3 weeks into it, I think, Jinx said. We had to storm a beachhead and be the decoys in an infested city so the rest of our troops could offload safely. It was chaotic, nerve-wracking, and costly. Lost a lot of good people that first week. But still just a drop in the bucket compared to what you went through.
Colin let out a huff.
So what about you guys? Jinx asked.
If I'm being honest, I'm still processing it, Avery admitted. If I live to be 100, I still may not be ready to talk about it.
Fair enough, Jinx agreed. I know some old-timers like that. Saw things in the war they never wanted to talk about. No shame in it, Avery.
It's just up ahead there. See it? Colin asked, pointing.
Avery slowed to a stop, and the trio looked out towards the hardware store. There was a solar-powered streetlight illuminating the parking lot, with about 30 zombies hanging around. Okay, boys, I'm at your disposal, Jinx said.
Our disposal?
Avery asked. This is your show, at least for the moment, Jinx replied. I'm here to help, so tell me what you want. Avery and Colin exchanged glances, the former shrugging and inclining his head towards the latter.
How you feel about being the rabbit?
Colin asked. That's right in my wheelhouse, Jinx replied easily. What you thinking?
Avery, drive down that side road there so we can see behind the building, Colin said.
Avery nodded and made the turn, driving slowly with the lights off. They made it to the side road, the three of them looking down towards the hardware store. There were only a couple of ghouls milling about behind the building, along with some corpses on the ground near the back door.
Can we get in that way? Jinx asked.
Avery shook his head.
We tried yesterday, but it was a no-go.
Locked up tight? The corporal asked.
The lock was open, but it's chained or barred from the inside, Colin replied.
So we're likely to find some company inside, huh? Jinx asked.
That's our guess, Avery replied. If we clear that group out, there are windows by the front door, so we can scope it out before going in.
Jinx nodded slowly. Okay, I can handle that group by the back door, then start luring them around to the back, he said. Then what?
We come up from behind and start picking them off, Colin said. These things may be dangerous in packs, but they're stupider than a sack of doorknobs.
As long as we're quiet, we shouldn't have any trouble,
Avery said.
As long as you keep them occupied, that is, Colin added.
Jinx nodded sharply. Don't worry, they'll be focused on me, he promised.
Let's get it done then, Colin said.
Jinx hopped out of the vehicle, but leaned in before shutting the door. Give me 3 minutes, and I'll have their attention,
he said. "Then you guys can go to work."
"We got you covered," Avery said. Jinx nodded and jogged off towards the hardware store, pulling out a knife as he got closer. He didn't break stride, casually working his way up to the ghouls. The two men watched as the corporal wove his way in and out between the zombies, delivering death blows, shoving corpses to the side, and dispatching the group with ease.
"He's good,"
Avery murmured.
"Uh-huh,"
Colin agreed.
"Look, I know you don't like him or his friends,"
Avery said slowly.
"but we need him right now. Won't need him forever, though,"
Colin muttered. Avery chuckled, shaking his head, and Jinx finished his job, motioning for them to get out of the SUV.
"Come on, let's get to work,"
Avery said. The two men got out, pulling their makeshift metal spears, giving them some reach as they worked their way back towards the main road. Meanwhile, Jinx stood by the corner at the back of the building. He looked down towards the main road, relieved that his assault on the back lot ghouls hadn't attracted any attention. From his vantage point, he could see a handful of them in front of the store, all of them looking towards the entrance.
"All right, here we go again,"
he muttered, and casually walked up, dragging the tip of his blade against the concrete wall, sending a metallic scraping sound into the air. This garnered the attention of a couple of zombies, who looked his way and started shambling, moaning in excitement. The duo that broke away from the pack didn't last long, as Jinx jammed his knife into the lead one and shoved it back into the other, knocking it down to one knee. As it got back up, he stabbed it on top of the head. He unceremoniously shoved it to the side, looking up towards the rest of the pack. At least, where the rest of the pack should have been. The noise hadn't attracted any others. He shook his head, letting out a sigh as he walked closer to the front of the building.
"Come on, guys, work with me here,"
he said, and moved away from the building a bit, giving him plenty of room to maneuver. The mob was still nearly 30 strong, all focused on the front of the building. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a deafening whistle. Almost in unison, the mob of creatures turned towards him, letting out a collective excited moan as they began coming his way.
"That's more like it,"
he commended.
"Come on, right this way."
Jinx started backing up, glancing over his shoulder to make sure there weren't any surprises coming up behind him. A couple of the creatures were a little faster than the others, getting a few yards clear of the mob. Jinx stepped forward, taking one of them down and shoving it back before retreating. The other creature reached out, narrowly missing grabbing his arm.
"Okay, that was a little too close for comfort,"
Jinx muttered.
"I think I'm going to let the good old boys who would gladly feed me to these things take care of them."
He chuckled to himself, realizing just how bad of a situation he was in. He stared down a mob of flesh-eating zombies, and they were the least of his worries. As he got towards the back of the building, he jumped up, looking over the horde. He could see Avery and Colin working hard with their spears, taking down the creatures one by one with precision jabs to the back of their heads. Jinx let out a little more noise, making sure the creatures followed him around the corner of the building. As he went, he spotted another creature that had emerged from the opposite side of the building. He broke from his march, running over and jamming the knife into its eye, shoving it to the side. He looked back at the mob coming around the corner with him, but it was rapidly becoming thinner. He could hear the attacks from Colin and Avery behind them, which was drawing attention back towards them. Jinx let out another big whistle, pulling them his way before stepping up and stabbing another ghoul and shoving it aside. Several creatures reached for him, which narrowly missed him, but it didn't stop his attack. He took down a couple more, being loud while doing so to keep their attention on him. Finally, there were only a few zombies left, and Jinx stepped back, allowing the duo to finish them up. They expertly stepped forward and used their spears to take the creatures out with ease. A few moments later, the scene was calm, nothing left standing except for the trio of warriors.
"That's some solid work, guys," he commended. "Like I said, not our first rodeo," Colin quipped.
Avery looked past Jinx at the fresh pile of corpses behind him.
"Clearly not yours either," he said.
"Nope," Jinx said, shaking his head.
"Come on, let's get inside."
He led them around the building to the front, pausing at the side and looking out from the shadows towards the roads across from them. He stared intently for several moments, making sure that their assault hadn't brought in reinforcements. Luckily, it hadn't.
"Come on,"
Jinx said, heading up to the door as the others looked inside.
"Got some movement near the back,"
Avery said.
"How much?"
Jinx asked.
3, maybe 4 of those things,"
Colin confirmed.
"Get ready,
because they're going to be coming our way," Jinx said, looking through the glass on the door, finding a metal bar across the handle that prevented it from being opened. He looked around the immediate vicinity of the door inside, making sure there wasn't anything close to him. Using the hilt of his knife, he smashed out a portion of the window closest to the lock, which got the attention of the monsters inside. He quickly reached in and unlocked the door, pulling out the metal bar and throwing it open. The trio rushed inside, Avery and Colin heading over to deal with the zombies as Jinx shut the door and secured it. The duo dispatched the creatures with ease as Jinx stared out to the road, making sure they were in the clear.
"We're clear here,"
Avery called.
"So what are we looking for?"
Colin asked.
"Every bit of flammable liquid you can find, for starters,"
Jinx said.
"Need some plastic PVC pipe or gutters, duct tape, and something we can use as a reservoir."
Both men stared blankly at him, confused by his shopping list.
"That's interesting,"
Avery said.
"What the hell are you going to make with that?"
Colin asked. Jinx grinned.
"Going to go full biblical on their asses and make it rain fire and brimstone," Jinx declared.
The men shared a glance and shrugged before heading off into the store to get what they needed. Jinx went on his own shopping spree, looking for a way to deliver the fire portion of their attack.
"These shopping trips are so much easier when I don't have a budget,"
he said brightly as he grabbed a shopping cart and ran off into the store. Chapter 6. Blake led Calvin and Zion down the highway, which had several dozen cars scattered about, some of which had been pushed out of the way. There were corpses littering the road that they stepped over. To their right was the main part of the town, the downtown area with multiple smaller buildings, 2- and 3-story structures. The night air was filled with moans coming from the town.
"If I didn't know what that represented, I might even think it was beautiful,"
Calvin said wistfully. "We need to get you out more," Zion quipped.
"What?"
Calvin asked.
"It takes me back to being a kid, playing in the playground by the church while the choir was going. Couldn't really understand the words, but the tones were similar."
He glanced at Blake.
"Come on, you know what I'm talking about."
Blake shook his head.
"I'm with Zion. We need to get you out more," he said.
Zion let out a chuckle as Calvin scoffed, waving them off. They walked for a few more moments, only the moans filling the void, until Zion couldn't stay silent any longer. He knew this time was important to build rapport with Blake, and needed to take the opportunity. "So, you got a good-sized survivor camp, huh?" he asked casually.
"Just between us?"
Blake asked, cocking a brow. "Of course," Zion assured him.
"Don't take this the wrong way,"
Blake said quickly.
"Nothing against your friend Jinx there, but me and mine aren't exactly happy with the government and military after what they put us through." "Preaching to the choir, my brother," Calvin declared. "Shit, man. They abandoned us and then rained hellfire down on our heads."
Blake nodded, eyes wide.
"Couple weeks ago, right?"
he asked.
"That was over you guys?"
"Not directly, but close enough to drive us out of our home," Zion confirmed. Blake shook his head.
"Man, it's one thing for them to be selfish and run away,
But to try to kill you to boot? He scoffed. Those military boys are lucky you didn't shoot them on sight. Who says we didn't? Calvin asked.
Blake shot him a skeptical stare.
I mean, you brought half a dozen to my doorstep,
he said dryly.
Those weren't the first ones who came a-knocking,
Calvin drawled.
Is that right?
Blake asked, still clearly not convinced. Calvin and I took out 5 ourselves just a couple of days ago, Zion explained. Blake's brow furrowed, jerking a thumb over his shoulder.
But you left these guys alive? He asked.
Means to an end, Zion replied easily. I'm sure you would have done the same in our situation. Blake stiffened.
What makes you say that? He asked.
Because you're using them to help get your friends to safety, just like we did, Zion replied. Blake paused and chuckled.
Fair enough, he said, but doesn't quite explain why you're down here in my neck of the woods with them.
Some of their friends weren't too pleased we killed some of theirs, Zion explained. So it was easier to skip town for a bit than to get into a full-on war with the military. Don't get me wrong, we're some bona fide badasses, but we don't exactly have the firepower to take on the full force of the military.
Blake smirked, going silent a few moments, like he was having an internal debate. Finally, he nodded to himself.
"Well," he drawled, "what if I could offer you a little muscle? Help you push back that oppressive boot trying to stomp on you?"
Zion and Calvin exchanged a glance, shrugging and nodding as if they were interested in the offer, instead of just playing along with Blake's game.
"I think we're not really in a position to turn it down," Zion admitted.
"So, what you thinking?" Calvin asked.
Blake raised a palm.
"Now, I'm not the decision-maker by any means, but I do hold some sway with those who are," he admitted. "I think, at minimum, we can get you some heavy-duty gunners and some snipers to hold them at bay if they try to come for you."
"We have gunners. If we're taking on the military, then we're going to need more than that," Zion replied.
Blake nodded.
"That's true, but that kind of help comes at a price," he said.
"What kind of price?" Zion asked.
"Like any community, we have needs," Blake replied. "Question is, what can you offer us?"
"We don't have much in the way of resources," Zion admitted.
"But we do have some kick-ass engineers," Calvin piped up.
Blake's eyebrows rose.
"Engineers, huh?"
he asked thoughtfully.
"Oh yeah, my girl is one of them," Calvin said with a wide grin. "They can whip up all sorts of useful shit."
Blake nodded.
"My people might be good with that," he said.
"Just so we're clear, though," Zion said firmly, "my people aren't going anywhere they don't want to go. I'm not going to force them to switch survivor camps against their will."
"That's fair," Blake agreed. "But just so I'm clear, we're not just a group of survivors, Zion. We have armies. Plural."
Calvin's eyes nearly bugged out of his head.
"Armies? How?" he blurted. "Well, when this whole apocalypse kicked off, there were a lot of groups up here that were off doing their own thing," Blake began. "Had their own compounds, their own hierarchy, and really wasn't interested in coming together for the greater good. That changed once the runners slowed down. We sent a few emissaries, cut a few deals, and came to the conclusion that we'd be stronger together than fighting over the same resources. So, the Alliance was created."
"The Alliance?" Zion asked. Blake waved a non-committal hand in the air.
"Yeah, there was a lot to get into, but that can wait," he said vaguely.
He pointed up ahead to a spot on the highway where cars lined up nose to nose, stretching across the entirety of the road. On the other side were about a dozen ghouls that had found their way up to it, excited to see humans on the other side.
"Thought you said this highway was cleared," Calvin said. "It is, but some of the barricades on the ramps are makeshift," Blake said. "We've had a couple of leaks the last couple of days, hence the extra protection."
"Should be easy enough to deal with," Zion said. All three drew bladed weapons, hopping up onto the cars and delivering death blows one by one. Several moments later, the highway was silent and the path was clear.
"Our spot is about 50 yards up," Blake said. "We'll just have to check the barricade to make sure it's sturdy. It should be, but you never know."
As they walked along the highway, the moans from downtown got louder and louder, as if they were approaching the chorus of the damned. They eventually got to the exit ramp leading to downtown, looking over to the barricade, which consisted of several rows of cars lined up, and some sheet metal fastened to it.
"It looks good, but if you want to hang here, I'm going to take a closer look," Blake said.
Zion nodded. "Take your time. I don't think we're going anywhere anytime soon," he said.
"Let's just hope that your military buddy knows what he's doing," Blake warned.
He walked off as the two men walked over to the edge of the highway, leaning on the retaining wall. They looked out over the downtown area, shaking their heads at the sight. There was a building a couple of blocks away that was the focus of all the attention. From their vantage point, they could see hundreds of zombies all pressed against the two-story building, trying to get inside. They were shoulder to shoulder, stretching from the building down half the block. There wasn't an inch of road visible.
"So, what you think?" Calvin asked.
"I think Jinx is going to have to pull another rabbit out of his hat," Zion muttered.
"No, I mean about Blake and his armies," Calvin said.
Zion sighed. "Gonna have to be a big-ass rabbit." Chapter 7. Jinx led Avery and Colin up the street, taking cover behind a building. The target building where Martin was trapped was 3 blocks north and 1 to the west. Their target building was the 3-story office building 1 block north and 1 to the west. Avery and Colin had their spears, along with large canvas bags filled with supplies from the hardware store. Jinx had one as well. Most of the ghouls were several blocks up, all clamoring to get into where Martin was. However, there were a couple dozen between them and their building. Jinx looked out towards it, looking for an entry point. The bottom floor of the building was mostly glass that looked into the lobby of a high-end office building. He couldn't really see into it, but he could see it was mostly open right past the windows. He scanned the area, looking for an entry point, but came up empty.
"I'm not seeing a door,"
Jinx said. "There's one," Avery said. Jinx sighed.
"Well, I assume that there is," he said. "But it's just not one I can see at the moment."
Colin shook his head, taking point.
"I swear you military boys would be lost without someone with common sense,"
he muttered, and looked out towards the road with his rifle scope.
"There, on the east side of the building, far side."
He handed the scope off to Jinx, who looked through it and shook his head.
"Way too close to the mob," he said. "We can handle it,"
Colin replied defensively. Jinx shook his head.
"It's no good," he said firmly. "If we make even the slightest bit of noise, then we're just going to be trapped like your buddy is. It's no good."
Colin growled, but Avery stepped in as the voice of reason. "Okay, then how are we getting in?" he asked.
"We're going through the glass,"
Jinx said simply. Both men stared at him like he had grown a second head. "You want to run that by us one more time there?" Avery asked.
"We're going in through the glass,"
Jinx repeated, slower this time.
"You're out of your damn mind,"
Colin said.
"No debate there," Jinx replied with a grin. "But that's how we're getting inside." "No way this is happening,"
Colin snarled. Avery put up his hand to stop his friend from popping off.
"How?"
he asked.
"Look at the bottom portion of the glass, south side of the building,"
Jinx instructed, handing over the scope. Avery peered through it, finding a metal bar a few feet off of the ground, creating a smaller window portion at the bottom.
"In my experience, those things don't crawl very well, as long as they don't get knocked down," Jinx explained. So if any of them follow us, we just have to keep them on their feet. That will prevent them from getting inside." "But how the hell are we getting inside?" Colin demanded. "That's going to be safety stuff, so we can't just break through it." "Just got to get a corner loose, and we can pop the paint out," Jinx replied. "It's going to take me a minute to get that edge, so you two are going to have to cover me. You good with that?" The men shared a glance, and Colin shrugged, but Avery gave a confident nod. "We got you," he said. "Okay, this is the plan," Jinx said. "We move quickly and quietly to the south side of the building. Do not engage until we are behind cover. After that, start stabbing away. We're going to be attracting attention as soon as we start moving, so just be ready for it. If you need me to help, tell me." He took a step, stopped, and looked back. "But given how exposed we're about to be, don't need me." Avery and Colin readied their spears, following him out from behind cover, moving quickly to the west across the street. They slowly started to move up the side of the building to the north, their target within 30 yards or so. There were zombies in the road who were about 15 yards away that hadn't noticed them yet. The moon wasn't too bright at the moment, so they were able to conceal themselves in the shadows, but that only lasted a few moments. Finally, they made it to the corner, looking across towards the target 2-story building. Jinx quickly took stock of the situation, about 15 zombies in the road on that side, and spread out pretty well. His concern was the few dozen ghouls to his right, running up the side of the building. Jinx looked back to the others, using hand signals, pointing out the window he was going for, which was near the middle of the building. He pointed to the center zombie, motioning that he was going to take care of it, and giving instructions on who the others should attack. They both nodded, and they were ready to move. Jinx gave them a nod and a thumbs up, along with a crazed big smile that concerned both civilians. It looked like he lived for this kind of dangerous chaos, which was exactly the truth. The corporal broke out into a sprint, running straight for his target creature. It got a knife in the side of the head, too slow to even turn to see its attacker. As it hit the ground, he got to the glass, unslinging his canvas bag and tossing it to the ground. He immediately rolled onto his stomach, something that would terrify even the most hardened warrior in times like this. But Jinx had a grin on his face, enjoying it as he went to work on the corner of the window. Avery and Colin played catch-up, getting to the center of the road and beginning to deliver kill shots with their spears. They dropped a few creatures until Avery, who was to the right of Jinx, saw several zombies coming around the corner. He peeked over his shoulder, finding that Colin only had a few creatures to deal with. He didn't want to yell out, but needed to get his attention. He broke formation, running over to Colin and helping him quickly take out his few ghouls. "What are you doing?" Colin hissed. "Need your help over there," Avery replied, inclining his head. Colin looked back at the 15 to 20 creatures coming around the corner of the building. They quickly moved back over to it, tossing their bags by Jinx. "You better hurry up, or we're dinner," Colin said as they passed. Jinx glanced over at the mob coming their way, about 20 yards from where he was. He immediately started using his palm to smack the hilt of his knife into the edge of the pane of glass. The tip ripped up the material used to hold it in place, and he managed to get it completely through the space between the glass and the frame. "Finally!" he breathed. He moved the knife as hard as he could along the top of the glass, ripping away the connective material. As he worked on it, Colin and Avery were fighting a losing battle. They jabbed as quickly as they could at the zombies coming at them, dropping one after the other, but the creatures kept pushing forward. With every stab, they had to take 3 steps back, getting closer and closer to Jinx. "Jinx!" Colin urged. "Almost there," the corporal assured him, sliding his blade from side to side, managing to get it horizontal. He quickly loosened it enough so he could pry it towards him. He held the space open and slipped his hand behind the glass, pulling as hard as he could.
It took several pulls before the pane fully broke free from the frame, and he pulled it to the ground, sliding it to the side before grabbing the bags and shoving them inside.
"We're in!" he barked. "Move!"
Avery came first, breaking away from the pack. As he went, Jinx grabbed his spear and took his spot on the line. It took Avery a moment to slide through, but once he was in, he stuck his head back into the opening.
"Colin!"
he cried. Colin stabbed one more ghoul before turning and running as Jinx continued to fight the horde, now 10 yards from the window, and closing quickly. They were 6 bodies across and several deep, with more coming from the side of the building. Jinx dropped a couple more before glancing back and seeing that the window was clear. He didn't bother with a final shot, instead of turning and running. He slid the spear through the window before doing a headfirst slide through the opening. As he cleared the threshold, he looked over at Avery and Colin, who were dragging a heavy bench over towards the window. He quickly got to his feet to help them out. They flipped it over, pushing the flat side against the window before standing straight up. Jinx moved to another window, tapping it several times at head height to keep the attention high.
"Spread out and do the same," he instructed, "and keep your head on a swivel. We might not be alone in here."
The 2 men nodded and did as they were told. It took several minutes to spread the mob out so that they were only a couple of bodies deep, posing no threat to break through the windows. Once Jinx was satisfied that they were safe, he gave one last tug on the bench to make sure it was heavy enough. He nodded and motioned for the others to follow.
"Grab your bags. We gotta get upstairs,"
Jinx said.
"Second or third?"
Avery asked.
"Start with the third,"
Jinx replied.
"If it's clear, then that's where we'll set up."
They nodded and began working their way through the building, carefully taking precautions as they went. They finally found the emergency stairwell near the elevators, readying their weapons and keeping their ears sharp as Jinx slowly opened the door. It was all quiet inside as Jinx pulled out a flashlight, shining it up the concrete stairwell. He moved slowly, but didn't hear anything.
"Come on, I think we're good,"
he said quietly, leading them up.
"That was a hell of a plan to get us in here,"
Avery commended and poked his companion.
"Wasn't it, Colin?"
He seemed to be egging on his friend to keep the peace. Colin wrinkled his nose.
"Yeah, good plan,"
he said petulantly, like a 5-year-old being forced to apologize.
"Appreciate it, but no need for forced praise,"
Jinx said.
"I know Colin isn't exactly keen on being friends, and that's just fine, so long as you cover my ass. We get through this, get your friend home, and you can go back to pretending I don't exist."
"I can work with that," Colin agreed. The trio made it up to the top floor, and Jinx leaned against it, listening carefully for a few moments. Finally, he nodded.
"Don't hear anything," he said softly. "Could just mean they're away from the door, so stay on your toes."
The 2 men nodded as he opened the door, shining his light inside. It was a standard cubicle farm that didn't look like it had been touched since the apocalypse began. They moved through the floor, checking every single aisle and cubicle as they went. It took several minutes to clear the floor, but they did it.
"I got nothing," Avery said. "If anybody was here, then they didn't even make the smallest mess,"
Colin called back.
"Okay, find something heavy, because we have to knock out some glass,"
Jinx said. Both men exchanged a glance and a shrug, picking up some heavy chairs and carrying them over to the window, overlooking the western side street.
"Okay,"
Jinx said, pointing as he spoke.
"I need that window and that window taken out. I got this one."
The trio went to work, destroying the windows and sending glass crashing to the ground below. The sound as it hit the ground was horrific, creating a stir amongst some of the ghouls. Jinx watched several of them on the outer edges, looking around for the source of the noise, but eventually moving back to the mob.
"So, you want to tell us what the hell we're doing?"
Colin asked. "Yep," Jinx said, and slammed down his canvas bag on a desk, pulling out the PVC pipe. It was an inch or so thick and 6 feet long, and he had a couple dozen of them. He pulled a few out, along with a coupler, and started putting them together. He paused, looking up at the two men who stood there staring at him.
"Well, start building," he said. "Needs to be about 30 feet with a cap at one end."
They exchanged glances and got to work, but still looked intensely confused. "Okay, I'm still lost," Avery finally admitted. "How are we burning a mob with this?" Jinx grinned, reaching into his canvas bag and pulling out a screwdriver. He put it into his PVC pipe and smacked the hilt, sending the top through it. He rotated the pipe and did it again, and again.
"Makeshift sprinkler system," he said. "We're going to build this and connect it to a trash can from one of the desks and stretch them out of the window over the road. I have a battery-operated remote switch that will trigger the release, sending the flammable liquid through them and onto the street below. And, if we're lucky, the zombies. We have gallons of the stuff, so we should be able to coat a fair amount of them."
Colin shook his head. "What about the fire?" he asked. Jinx grinned wider, reaching into his bag and pulling out one of Finger's devices.
"A new friend of mine made this little beauty for me," he said. "It will just be hanging out at street level as the mob wanders by. Find a nice bench or something to place it on. The blast won't be particularly powerful, but it will be big and flamey, which, when combined with the raining shower of flaming liquid, should do a nice job of taking out a significant number of them."
Colin let out a huff, shaking his head. Avery, on the other hand, nodded in approval. "Should be fun to see that go off," he said.
"First things first, gotta get everything set up," Jinx said, raising a finger. "Going to take someone. One of you have the radio?"
Avery nodded, pulling it out and holding it up.
"Give them a buzz. Let them know we're working on it," Jinx instructed. "Should be a half hour or so, and then we'll be on the move."
Avery nodded and clicked it on. "Blake, you copy?" he asked.
"I'm here. What's your status?" Blake replied.
"On the 3rd floor. 30 until we move," Avery said.
"How long until detonation?" Blake asked.
Avery looked over at Jinx, who bobbed his head back and forth for a moment, doing the mental math.
"Maybe an hour?" the corporal said.
"An hour, tops," Avery said into the radio.
"Okay, we're getting into position now," Blake replied. "Radio when you're moving."
"Copy that," Avery said. Jinx sighed.
"Really should have said 90 minutes, he muttered. "Oh well, we got this."
He reached into his bag, tossing some screwdrivers over to the others, and they got to work, frantically building the improvised device. Chapter 8. Blake, Calvin, and Zion stood at the edge of the highway, looking down at the mob below. In the distance, they could see the other group working to extend the PVC out the window over the road.
"Come on. We need to get down to street level," Blake said. "Building right there should do nicely. We set it up to be a backup safe house, so it's easy access."
Calvin looked down at the couple dozen zombies around the building, shaking his head.
"Shouldn't we just wait for them to move when we set off the diversion?"
he asked. Zion shook his head. "No, Blake's right," he said. "We might have a small window to get Morton out of there. Gotta be as close as possible. Besides, when have you ever worried about fighting off a few ghouls?"
"That's more than a few," Calvin said dryly. "You good with that rifle?" Blake asked.
Calvin straightened his shoulders.
"Oh yeah, probably the best shot you ever met," he declared.
Blake deadpanned.
"My best friend was a Special Forces sniper," he said.
"Oh, well," Calvin said slowly.
"My statement still stands."
Blake chuckled.
"Love the confidence," he said. "I tell you what, why don't you stay up here and cover us?" "That good with you?" Calvin asked, turning to Zion.
"You know me. I always feel most comfortable with you covering my ass," Zion replied.
"All right. If anything gets too close for comfort, I'll make them pay,"
Calvin said, raising a victory fist.
Just try to keep it to a minimum, Blake warned. At least until we're heading back. Don't want to pull them our way until absolutely necessary. I got you, Bubba, Calvin promised. Now you two get going.
The duo nodded and began walking down the exit ramp towards the barricade.
Is he really as good as he claims? Blake asked.
If anything, he's underselling himself, Zion said. Blake nodded thoughtfully.
Glad to have him on board, then,
he said. They made it to the barricade, and Blake pulled down one of the pieces of sheet metal, creating a path over the vehicles for them. A handful of zombies clustered around the other side, clamoring for fresh meat.
You want to do the honors?
Blake asked. Gladly, Zion said, and hopped up, pulling out a blade and going to work on the zombies, stabbing them in the top of their heads one by one. As he cleared out a row, Blake jumped up and joined in. Within moments, the threat was cleared. They hopped down onto the street, looking around cautiously, weapons at the ready. Blake motioned for them to head south towards the closest building, heading around back. As they got to the main road, they looked down and saw dozens of zombies milling about, unaware of their presence. They scurried across, trying to stay quiet, but encountering a little bit of resistance near the building. Both men stabbed creatures in the head and held them as they fell to minimize the noise. Blake attacked another one that stepped up, but his blade glanced off of the side of the creature's skull.
Fuck,
he muttered without thinking as he retreated. Zion turned and delivered a killing blow, but the damage had been done, and the moans on the road intensified as the zombies down the street realized they had fresh prey, and began shambling their way. "Let's go," Zion hissed, running towards the back entrance to the building with Blake closely behind. There were a few creatures in the alleyway, but Zion just plowed through them, checking them into the wall like a hockey player taking out his frustrations on an opponent. They made it to the back door, and Blake went to work, flicking a couple of locks open and getting the door free.
"We're in,"
he said. They rushed inside as the creatures marched down the alley, slamming the door shut well before they got there. Zion secured the door as Blake grabbed a nearby camping lantern, lighting it up to illuminate the space. The storeroom was small and windowless, so the light wasn't a concern. There were rations in the corner set up on a table, like a budget reception desk.
"Sorry about that, man,"
Blake moaned, scrubbing a hand down his face.
"I realized as I was cussing that I was screwing the pooch."
"Happens to the best of us," Zion said, "but we're here and safe, no harm, no foul." Blake nodded and led them to the storeroom door, setting down the lantern before going through. The two of them went to the front, looking out the window. They could see the building Martin was in, along with the ocean of zombies standing between them.
"Got food in the back, tasty brand name stuff," Blake said. "Not that store brand crap, so we can chill for a bit and let your man do what he does."
Zion nodded as they headed to the back. "Gives you more time to tell me about your armies," he said. Blake chuckled, replying,
"Anything you want to know. I'm an open book."
Chapter 9. Jinx put the finishing touches on his contraption that would deliver flammable liquid to the masses below. He checked the remote trigger to release the fuel before they began filling the reservoir.
"Okay, we're looking good," the corporal said. "Let's fill it up."
Avery nodded and started pouring in 2 canisters. As he worked, Jinx walked over to the open window standing beside Colin. They surveyed the multiple PVC pipes sticking out across the road, nearly going all the way across.
"Gotta admit, this is pretty damn ingenious," Colin commended. "If it works, that is."
"Not the first time I've built something like this,"
Jinx replied. Colin crossed his arms.
"Okay,"
he said slowly.
"But there's one little part of your plan that's still a mystery."
"What's that?" the corporal asked, cocking a brow.
"How the hell are we getting out of here?"
Colin asked, pointing down at the zombies around every bit of the building.
"Going right out the front door,"
Jinx said with a smirk. Colin shut his eyes and sighed, shaking his head in disbelief.
"Of course that's the plan," he muttered.
"Just make sure you got your running shoes on," Jinx said, "because it's going to be a sprint to the next building across the intersection there. And we aren't going to be there long."
"I thought you were going to rig it to blow," Colin asked.
"I am," Jinx said. "All we have to do is find the maintenance room."
"What's in there?"
Colin asked, cocking a brow. Jinx shrugged.
"Always something that goes boom in the maintenance room," he replied. "Gas line, boiler, generator. Just kick the door in, toss in one of my buddy's devices, and run like hell."
Colin blinked at him.
"How are you not dead yet?" he asked,
voice breathless with awe. The corporal shrugged.
"Guess God thinks more of his creations need to be blown up," he joked. "Either that, or just pure dumb luck."
"I'm thinking the latter," Colin said dryly.
"Can't argue with that,"
Jinx quipped.
"Okay, we're filled to the brim," Avery announced. "Time to roll."
Jinx gave Colin a playful smack on the arm, receiving an unappreciative scowl in return. The corporal didn't acknowledge it, going back to his bag and pulling out 2 devices that Fingers had made for him. He pocketed the smaller of the 2, prepping the fireball one.
"Okay, let's get downstairs," Jinx said, "but stay out of sight until I give the signal."
"The reception desk in the middle of the floor should work," Colin said. "It's dark in there, so they shouldn't spot us getting up to it."
"That work?" Avery asked.
"Good enough for me," Jinx said. "Colin, lead the way."
Colin nodded and led the group down the stairs, pausing at the door leading to the main floor. He cracked it open, sticking his head out far enough to see the bench they moved over to cover the window. The zombies were still standing at the window, paying the breach no attention.
"Can't be too careful,"
Colin said. Jinx nodded and Colin led the trio out into the main floor, taking cover at the reception desk. The corporal popped his head up over the top, looking towards the main doors, leading to the western side of the building where their pipes were hanging over. There were a few dozen zombies on that side, with a handful plastered on the glass trying to get inside, attracted by the noise the creatures on the other side were making. There were a few by the front glass double doors. Jinx tapped Colin and motioned for the scope, and the other man handed it over. The corporal focused on the door itself, looking at the locking mechanism. A simple throw deadbolt. He checked the rest of the door to make sure there wasn't something else holding it shut, and there wasn't.
"Okay, we're shoving our way out that door and heading diagonally across the street to the next building," he said quietly. "We're going to have some heat on us, so we're not going to be subtle when getting inside."
"What are you thinking?" Avery asked.
"Find a window, shoot it out, and rush inside," Jinx said.
Colin's brow furrowed.
"Won't that just let those things follow us inside?" he asked.
Jinx nodded.
"Yep, but we don't care about that," he said.
"I mean, I kind of care about that,"
Avery muttered.
"Don't worry," Jinx said. "The maintenance room has got to be along the outer wall somewhere. We find it, toss this bad boy in, and run like hell."
He tapped his pocket, holding the device for emphasis.
"How much time are we going to have?" Colin asked. "Think 5 minutes is enough?" Jinx replied.
Colin sighed.
"If I say no, are you going to change it?" he asked.
The corporal grinned.
"Nope," he said.
"Then why ask?"
Colin grunted.
"Just being polite,"
Jinx said brightly. Colin shook his head and Avery hid a chuckle behind his hand.
"Before we go, Avery, let the others know some shit's going down within 10 minutes, Jinx instructed.
Avery nodded and pulled out his radio.
"Blake, you copy?" he asked.
"What you got?"
Blake replied immediately.
"We're about to move," Avery said. "Expect some fireworks within 10 minutes.
"Copy that,"
Blake replied. Avery nodded to Jinx as he pocketed his walkie-talkie, and the corporal led the trio out from hiding. running over to the door as quickly as he could. As the zombies realized they were there, Jinx flicked open the lock and shoved them open as hard as he could. The force was enough to send the creatures stumbling back, giving them room to get out of the building. The noise attracted the other nearby ghouls, which Avery and Colin aimed up to attack with their spears as Jinx readied the flammable device. He ran over to a nearby bench, setting it right in the middle of it before giving a whistle to the others, who were putting down a couple of the ghouls to buy him some time.
"Let's move,"
Jinx said. The trio ran down the road, the chorus of moans behind them intensifying. They picked up speed, running across the intersection, looking around and seeing zombies coming from all directions, but none within 15 yards. Jinx pulled out his handgun as he got within 10 yards of the building, firing half a mag as he ran, ripping through the large pane of glass on the ground floor. His grouping was good, weakening the glass in the middle. It was safety stuff, so it didn't shatter and fall, but it was weakened. Jinx pumped his legs hard, leaping into the air and leading with his shoulder, head down, and crashed through the window. The force of his body impacting it was enough to break it down, creating a massive hole for the trio to get through. Avery and Colin followed, hot on his heels, the former grabbing Jinx's arm to help him up.
"What the hell was that?"
he cried. Jinx grinned through a bloody cut on his face.
"Not as much fun as I thought it was going to be," he admitted. "Come on, we gotta find that room."
Jinx pulled out his flashlight, running through the outside of the building, scanning the wall for the maintenance room. He was solely focused on that, not paying attention to anything in the room filled with cubicles. As he went, Avery let out a scream, causing the corporal to stop in his tracks and turn. Avery was on the ground, a zombie on top of him, going in for a bite. Jinx didn't hesitate, pointing his gun in that direction, instinctually aiming and firing. The bullet hit the monster on the top of its head, dropping it in a heap on top of its almost meal. Colin rushed over and hauled the corpse off of his friend, helping him up.
"You good?"
he asked.
"Yeah, it didn't bite me,"
Avery huffed, clearly shaken from the ordeal. Before they could get moving again, moaning echoed from within the building, not at the window where they'd come in, but all around them.
"We gotta hurry,"
Jinx urged. They took off running again, scanning the walls. Finally, they found the maintenance room. Jinx tried the door, but it was locked, so he backed up and fired several times at the handle, ripping it to shreds. He opened the door and shone his flashlight inside, finding several machines and pipes. He clicked the timer on the device and slid it inside, turning around to find the other two busily stabbing zombies in the face with their spears.
5 minutes!
Jinx bellowed. Both men broke away from their attack, following the corporal as he led the way towards the back of the building. They approached an emergency exit on the concrete back wall, and Jinx didn't hesitate, bursting through it and into a parking lot, weapons at the ready. There were a handful of ghouls around, but none closer than 20 yards. They turned and began coming towards the noise as Colin brought up the rear, slamming the emergency door behind him.
"Which way?"
he demanded. Jinx pointed east.
"Haul ass that way!"
he barked. They ran to the east, along the southern portions of the building a block away from the trap building. They got a few blocks away, back to the outskirts of town. They moved fast enough that they left the creatures in the dust behind them. They made it into a small building with a good view of downtown, all three breathing heavily from their sprinting. They looked around, finding no immediate threat, and relaxed for a minute.
"How much time?"
Colin huffed.
"Any moment now,"
Jinx replied. The three of them watched intently, hoping that Jinx was right in his decision to just toss a bomb and run. A tense moment went by, and nothing happened.
"Shit, now what?"
Colin groaned.
"Patience," Jinx murmured. "We have patience."
He grunted.
"Yeah, But clearly it's not.
Before he could even finish his sentence, a deafening blast rattled the windows and the very foundation of the building they were in. The night sky lit up with a fireball shooting into the air. Jinx grinned wide, like a kid looking at a vast selection of ice cream, and glanced over at Colin with a sly glint in his eye.
I stand corrected,
Colin admitted, giving a conciliatory nod.
What about the trap?
Avery asked.
When do we set that off?
Jinx shrugged.
5 minutes or so, he said. Give it another 5 minutes after that before setting off the firebomb.
Good enough for me,
Colin agreed. Avery let out an excited laugh, clearly bewildered that they'd managed to survive their little adventure. He collapsed in the corner, taking a breather, and pulled out the walkie-talkie.
Why are you calling Blake?
Colin wondered.
Avery shrugged.
Let him know things are rolling, he said.
If he didn't hear that, then he has bigger issues,
Colin said. Jinx smirked.
Hate to set a precedent by agreeing with Colin, but he's right, he drawled.
Avery nodded and pocketed the radio, returning to his relaxing. Jinx looked out the window, but kept the other two in his periphery.
This is the end of my use to them, he thought. Better stay frosty.
Chapter 10. Zion and Blake watched from their vantage point as zombies continued to flow away from the target building. Several minutes had passed since the explosion went off, and the flammable liquid had been flowing for several more minutes.
I thought they were going to set them on fire,
Blake mused. Doubt we're going to have to wait much longer, Zion said. They continued to watch out the window as their path cleared, when all of a sudden a gigantic fireball erupted from the other side of the building, along with a slight rumble from the explosion.
Jinx doesn't do anything small, does he?
Blake asked. Zion laughed. No, he does not, he said. They waited for another few silent moments for the best time to make their move. You know he's an asset, right? Zion asked softly. Like the rest of his troops.
That may be, Blake replied. But it's hard sell with my people.
Zion nodded. Still, you should make an effort, he said simply. Blake didn't answer, just giving a slight nod. He then pointed out the window towards the building, where there was mostly a clear path to the back door. There were only a few zombies in the area, with the rest a good 20 yards away and moving away from them.
Come on, let's go get my boy, Blake said.
Zion nodded and followed him out the front door. They moved quickly across the road, dispatching a few ghouls silently as they went, but rushing by others and knocking them to the ground. When they got to the door, Blake banged on it frantically.
Martin, we gotta go, buddy,
he yelled. Zion turned around, readying for battle as some of the creatures shambled towards the noise. The banging was loud, but the majority of the zombies continued moving away from them, with only a handful turning around.
Martin!
Blake cried. Zion stepped forward and took out a couple of creatures, kicking them to the ground and stabbing them in the head before retreating to the other side to continue his defense. Several more ghouls started coming his way, with a pack of 5 within a few yards of him. A shot rang out from behind him, taking out the zombie to his far left at the back of the pack. Zion didn't hesitate, moving to the right to start on that side. Another shot went off, dropping the next one in line as Zion fought. He took 2 out and simply took a step to the right, staring at the last remaining creature, the one in the middle. He grinned and watched as its head was ripped clean off by a well-placed shot. He looked back and gave Calvin a thumbs up. Finally, after several tense moments, the door unlatched and opened. A fit, all-American-looking guy in his mid-20s emerged, looking bewildered. Blake gave him a quick hug before stepping back and looking him over.
You okay?
He asked. Martin gave a little nod, his eyes harrowed.
Yeah? Just
I'd like to go home now, he said.
Soon, Blake promised. We good? Zion asked.
Yeah, let's move, Blake said.
Zion turned around, waving to Calvin, who he knew was watching them through his scope. The trio ran back towards the building they'd been in, but bypassed it, running straight for the highway. There were several zombies in the way, but Zion led the charge. They rushed through the ghouls as the occasional shot popped off in the distance, taking out some creatures in the thicker packs, making it easier to get through. Despite the danger, this kind of run had become routine for Zion. It didn't take long before they were back on the on-ramp, running hard towards the barricade with zombies behind them. Calvin waited there for them, standing on top of the vehicles and aiming his rifle back downrange. He fired a couple more shots, taking the heads off of some of the leaders and slowing the pack up. The group got to the barricade and over, with Calvin being the last one down. They picked up the sheet metal and put it back in place, jury-rigging it as best they could to hold them up.
"Y'all good?"
Calvin huffed. Zion nodded. "Yeah, easy as pie," he said.
"Come on, you need to see this," Calvin said.
The group shared confused looks as he led them back to the highway. They walked a bit so they were parallel with the trap street, pointing down, and everyone stood there in awe.
"Yeah, I'd say Jinx has outdone himself there," Zion breathed.
The entire street was completely engulfed in flames. Hundreds of zombies stood in the road, shambling a bit and collapsing in flaming heaps. The trap had worked perfectly and was still spraying out liquid, adding fuel to the fire, as it were.
"See? Told you he's an asset," Zion said.
"What's he talking about?"
Martin asked.
"One of his military buddies," Blake murmured.
"Oh," Martin breathed quietly.
"Come on, let's get back to the restaurant," Blake said. "I'm sure we can whip you up something good."
They headed back to the SUV, Zion and Calvin bringing up the rear. They exchanged concerned glances, unsure of what was going to come next. Chapter 11. Jinx rode shotgun with Avery behind the wheel and Colin behind him. They were mostly silent as they went, with the corporal constantly looking in the side mirror to keep an eye on his potential enemy.
"So, where'd you learn how to do that stuff?"
Avery asked. Not breaking eye contact with the side mirror, Jinx replied, "What stuff?"
"Making that trap back there," Avery said. "That's some ingenious stuff."
Jinx shrugged.
"Just some stuff you pick up while being a latchkey kid in a rural town," he said.
"Raised some hell in your youth, huh?"
Avery asked. The corporal snorted.
"Understatement," he said.
"What's the worst thing you did?"
Avery asked.
"Get caught,"
Jinx deadpanned. The other man laughed, shaking his head.
"Yeah, that's definitely the worst," he said. "But what's the worst thing you got away with?"
Jinx thought for a moment, then nodded.
"Probably nearly burning down the local high school," he replied.
"How'd you manage that?"
Avery gasped.
"In a nutshell, some of the football players were dicks to me," Jinx explained. "I wasn't the biggest kid, but I had the biggest mouth. I may have said a few negative things about their cognitive ability during class, but dumbed it down so they could understand the insult. Few of them jumped me after school, so I thought I'd get a little revenge."
Avery blinked at him.
"By burning down the school?" he asked.
"Waited until homecoming week, biggest day in my town's yearly existence," Jinx said wistfully. "Wanted to burn a little message into the 50-yard line, questioning their manhood for all the town to see."
"So what happened?"
Avery asked.
"Well, in my haste, I grabbed the gasoline instead of the kerosene, so the initial blast was a little bigger than anticipated," Jinx said sheepishly. "So instead of just burning in the message, I set the whole field on fire.
A little bit of wind and, yeah, it was really close to the school when the fire department got there.
And you got away with it? Avery asked. Jinx smiled slyly into the side mirror. Yep, he said. How? Avery demanded.
The football players weren't the only ones who thought I was a fun bullying target, Jinx continued. Couple troublemakers from our rival who were playing on homecoming weren't exactly fond of me either. So I did what any rational person would do. Wipe the prints from the gas can, plant it in the back of their truck, and make an anonymous call to the police.
Avery barked a laugh. Wow, he drawled. So what happened to them?
Never got confirmation, but I heard rumors about Juvie, Jinx said. All I know is that they never bothered me again.
Don't you think that was kind of harsh?
Colin piped up from the back seat.
Pinning a crime on someone else?
Jinx shrugged. If they hadn't have been dicks to me, they would have been just fine, he said. So the moral of the story is, don't fuck around with me, and you won't have to find out.
He made eye contact with Colin in the mirror during the last sentence, and the other man looked away. That's a hell of a story, Avery said. Remind me to stay on your good side. Jinx smirked as they drove off the road and back onto it to get around the barricade. Much to his surprise, there were a few zombies still caught up in the traps set around it, setting off alarm bells in his mind. A few moments later, they pulled up to the restaurant. Zion and Calvin's group were unloading their vehicle and taking in the night air. They turned as the SUV pulled up and the trio got out.
There's my boy, Zion declared with a grin. You really know how to light up a party, don't you? You should see me when I have time to plan, Jinx quipped.
Zion cracked a smile, and they clasped hands, coming in for a back-slapping bro hug. Avery and Colin exchanged pleasantries with Blake and Martin, talking softly. Calvin hung back a bit, acting like he was taking in the stars, but kept his ears sharp to listen to them.
Come on, let's get inside and get some food, Blake said. Yes, please. I've had nothing but rations today, Martin replied. Need something properly cooked.
As they walked in, the locals led the way, with Zion and Jinx a few yards behind them. Colin trailed after them with Calvin bringing up the rear, lingering while looking up at the sky.
You coming?
Colin asked, pausing.
Yeah, sorry. Always love these night skies, Calvin said. You go ahead.
Colin nodded and walked in, Calvin trailing slowly behind him. The group got inside, and there was nobody there. Blake, Martin, and Avery moved off to the side, leaving Zion and Jinx staring into an empty room.
What the fuck? Zion breathed.
There were clear signs of struggle. Some of the tables had been overturned, and there were bullet casings on the ground, as well as some blood. Jinx turned around just in time to see Colin raise his handgun. Before he could react, Colin's head exploded, sending blood and skull onto the stunned corporal. As the body fell, Calvin stood there, holding his own handgun, turning it towards the other three.
If y'all was smart, you wouldn't move an inch, he warned.
Blake shoved Avery towards Zion, who shoved him aside and to the ground. Martin attacked, taking a swing at Zion, but he ducked under it, grabbing Martin by the throat and choke-slamming him into the floor.
Lay there and hurt,
he growled as Martin's lungs emptied of air and he was left gasping. Calvin kept his gun on Avery, who lay face first against the floor. Jinx drew his handgun and fired at a running Blake. The bullet ripped through his knee, sending him falling to the ground, screaming in pain. Zion and Jinx stalked up to him, kicking his weapon away. They stood over him, looking at the quivering mass of flesh on the floor. The corporal's jovial attitude was gone, replaced with a frightening combination of cold and calculating.
Get a chair and some rope, he said. I'm going to find out where my people are.
He knelt down, grabbing a fistful of Blake's hair, aiming his pained face towards him. And unless you want to feel the most pain you've ever felt in your life, you're going to tell me. He slammed Blake's head into the floor before getting to his feet. His breaths came in hard pants as he struggled to contain his rage.
"What about these two?"
Calvin asked. "Tie them up," Jinx said, eyes burning. "Tie everyone up. Then take a seat and watch me go to work." The end.